Does she ever speak? Or is silence part of diversity policy now? The joke landed hard enough to make 3 executives laugh before they quickly looked down at the table. Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair at the head of the 48th-floor boardroom, silver cufflinks catching the pale Manhattan storm light pouring through the glass walls behind him. Outside, rain streaked across the skyline in long gray lines, turning the city into something cold and blurred. Inside, the room smelled like espresso, polished wood, and expensive cologne. Naomi Carter didn't react. She sat near the far end of the marble conference table with a navy folder closed neatly in front of her, hands folded, posture calm. Her silence seemed to irritate Daniel more than defiance ever could. "I'm serious," he continued with a smirk. "We've been here almost 2 hours, and Ms. Carter hasn't contributed a single word." A few uncomfortable smiles moved around the room. Helen Pierce, the company's lead attorney, adjusted her glasses but said nothing. Ethan Cole shifted in his chair, glancing nervously toward Naomi before quickly looking away. Daniel noticed. "Relax," he said lightly. "I'm trying to wake the room up before we sign away $900 million. That earned another round of restrained laughter. Naomi finally lifted her eyes from the table. Calm brown eyes. Steady. Unmoved. The kind of eyes that didn't rush to defend themselves because they had already survived worse than mockery in a glass tower. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer than he meant to. Something about the way she looked at him made the air feel thinner. Not angry. Not intimidated. Just patient. Like someone waiting for gravity to finish its work. Daniel cleared his throat and flipped open the acquisition binder in front of him. "Now," he said, regaining control of the room. "If legal has no more concerns, I'd like to finalize this before the markets close." Helen hesitated, barely noticeable, but Naomi saw it immediately. So did Ethan. Rain tapped harder against the windows. Somewhere beyond the conference room walls, thunder rolled low through the city like distant construction equipment. Daniel uncapped his fountain pen with a sharp click. Finally, one executive muttered under his breath. Naomi slowly reached for her folder. The movement was quiet, almost delicate, but somehow every eye in the room noticed it. Daniel smirked again. "Wait," he said mockingly. "She speaks through paperwork." A couple people laughed too quickly. Naomi ignored them. Her fingers slid across the dark blue folder before she opened it carefully. Inside sat a stack of documents marked with federal compliance seals and yellow tabs. Helen's expression changed instantly. The color drained from her face so fast it looked painful. Ethan noticed next. His breathing slowed. Daniel didn't. Not yet. He was still smiling as he lowered the pen toward the final signature line. Then Naomi spoke for the very first time. Softly, clearly. "If you sign that document before I do, federal prosecutors will enter this building before sunset." The room froze. Completely froze. Even the rain seemed quieter somehow. Daniel's pen stopped less than an inch above the paper. For the first time that morning, nobody laughed. Daniel Whitmore slowly lowered the pen onto the table, but this time the confidence was gone from his face. The silver skyline behind him flickered under another wave of rain, and somewhere far below the 48th floor, traffic horns echoed through the wet Manhattan streets like distant warnings. Nobody in the boardroom moved. Nobody even touched their coffee anymore. Helen Pierce stared at the federal seal visible inside Naomi Carter's folder as if she had just seen a loaded weapon sitting in the middle of the table. Ethan Cole swallowed hard and shifted his eyes toward Daniel, waiting for him to say something that could restore control to the room. But Daniel stayed silent for 3 long seconds. That alone scared everyone. "What exactly is this supposed to mean?" he finally asked, forcing a smile that no longer looked natural. Naomi did not answer immediately. She opened the folder fully now, revealing pages filled with compliance notes, highlighted transactions, and signatures from federal review offices. The soft rustle of paper sounded painfully loud in the frozen room. 3 months ago, Naomi said calmly, the Securities and Exchange Commission began monitoring irregular offshore transfers connected to the acquisition target. Daniel leaned back slowly. "That is impossible." "No," Naomi replied. "What is impossible is believing nobody in your executive circle noticed." One of the vice presidents cleared his throat nervously. Another reached for his phone under the table before quickly stopping himself. Naomi continued speaking in the same calm voice that somehow made every word feel heavier. The Federal Review was supposed to remain confidential until the final audit concluded. But this merger accelerated the timeline. Helen finally spoke, her voice thin and tight. Naomi, are you saying the government is already prepared to intervene? Naomi looked directly at her. If this agreement closes today, without my compliance authorization, investigators will freeze every associated account before the markets open tomorrow morning. The room went dead quiet again. Daniel stared at Naomi now with an expression that was no longer mocking. It was calculation. Fast, desperate calculation. The kind powerful men learned after years of surviving boardroom disasters and hostile takeovers. Why was I not informed? He asked sharply, turning toward Helen. Because, Naomi answered before Helen could speak. I ordered the review sealed until I confirmed who inside this company was leaking financial data. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. You? The single word carried disbelief more than anger. Naomi nodded once. You assumed my department existed for appearances. That assumption protected the investigation. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately, almost embarrassed for his own CEO. Rainwater slid down the massive glass windows behind Naomi, blurring the city lights into streaks of white and gold. Thunder rolled again, softer this time, like the storm was moving farther downtown. Daniel stood slowly from his chair. The movement was controlled, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. You expect me to believe that a compliance director has authority over a $900 million acquisition? Naomi reached into the folder and slid one document across the marble table. Helen grabbed it first. The moment her eyes scanned the bottom page, her face completely changed. Daniel, she whispered carefully. Her signature is attached to the federal protection waiver. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Helen looked up at him, almost unable to say it out loud. It means if she refuses to sign, this company becomes the target instead of the witness. Nobody spoke after that, not even Daniel. Because for the first time that morning, the most powerful man in the room realized the quiet black woman he mocked was the only thing standing between his empire and collapse. Daniel Whitmore slowly sat back down, but the movement no longer carried authority. The storm outside had darkened the entire skyline now, turning the massive windows behind the boardroom into sheets of gray glass streaked with rainwater and reflected city lights. Nobody reached for their laptops anymore. Nobody checked messages. Every person at that table was staring at Naomi Carter. The same woman most of them barely acknowledged during meetings was suddenly the center of gravity in the room. Daniel folded his hands together carefully. You are telling me, he said slowly, that federal investigators are prepared to destroy this company unless you approve the waiver personally. Naomi met his gaze without blinking. No, Mr. Whitmore. I am telling you they are prepared to expose the people responsible. What happens to the company afterward depends on the choices made in this room today. The words landed heavily. Ethan Cole looked down at the marble table, pretending to study his notes, but his mind was racing. He remembered the first week he joined Whitmore Capital 18 months earlier. Naomi had been the only executive who spoke to him like he mattered. Everyone else rushed through hallways with expensive watches and rehearsed smiles. Naomi had quietly asked whether he had eaten lunch on his first day. That memory suddenly returned to him with painful clarity. Daniel exhaled sharply through his nose. And who exactly are these people responsible? Naomi glanced toward the stack of acquisition documents. The answer to that question is sitting somewhere in this room. Silence. Cold and immediate. One executive shifted uncomfortably. Another loosened his tie. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, mixing with the distant sound of thunder rolling across Manhattan. Helen Pierce closed the federal waiver slowly, her fingers visibly tense. Naomi, she asked carefully, how long have you known? Naomi looked toward the rain beyond the glass before answering. Long enough to understand that nobody here would listen until the threat became personal. Daniel frowned hard at that. You could have come directly to me. For the first time, something flickered in Naomi's expression. Not anger. Disappointment. Deep and tired. I tried, she said quietly. The room stayed still. Daniel looked genuinely confused now. Naomi continued before he could respond. 6 months ago, I submitted a risk report regarding offshore shell accounts connected to the acquisition target. Your office marked it low priority. Daniel's face tightened slightly. Naomi reached into her folder again and slid a printed memo across the table. His signature sat at the bottom corner in black ink. Daniel stared at it silently. 3 months later, Naomi continued. I requested an internal audit review. Your chief operations officer canceled the investigation after 24 hours. Another document slid across the marble. Another signature. Another silence. Ethan could feel tension crawling through the room now, like static electricity before lightning strikes. Naomi's calmness somehow made everything worse. She never raised her voice. Never tried to embarrass anyone. She simply laid truth after truth onto the table like stones sinking into water. Daniel rubbed his jaw slowly. Why continue protecting us if you believe corruption existed here? Naomi looked directly at him. Because 8,000 employees work for this company. Secretaries, custodians, analysts, single parents, interns with student loans. Her voice remained steady, but softer now. They do not deserve to lose their livelihoods because powerful people thought rules only applied to everyone else. Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately. The rain tapped steadily against the glass walls while the city below glowed cold and distant beneath the storm clouds. Then suddenly Helen's phone vibrated against the table. The sharp sound cut through the silence like a knife. She glanced at the screen once and went pale. Daniel, she whispered carefully. Federal counsel just arrived downstairs. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to drop the moment Helen Pierce lowered her phone onto the marble table. Nobody asked her to repeat herself. Nobody needed to. The expression on her face had already done the work. Daniel Whitmore stood motionless beside his chair, staring at the dark reflection of himself in the rain-covered windows behind Naomi Carter. Federal counsel downstairs. The words echoed silently through the room like the beginning of an earthquake nobody could stop anymore. One executive quietly reached for his water glass, but his hand shook enough to make the ice clink against the crystal. Another looked toward the door as if expecting agents to walk in at any second. Naomi remained seated, calm, composed, almost unnaturally steady compared to the panic slowly spreading around her. Daniel finally looked back at Helen. Who exactly arrived? He asked. Helen swallowed once before answering. 2 attorneys from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They are requesting immediate access to the acquisition review documents. Ethan Cole felt his stomach tighten instantly. The room no longer felt like a board meeting. It felt like the final seconds before a plane lost altitude. Daniel turned sharply toward Naomi. You called them? Naomi shook her head once. No. They came because someone leaked information this morning. Daniel's jaw tightened. And you conveniently happen to know everything already. Naomi did not react to the accusation. Instead, she slowly closed the federal waiver and folded her hands on top of it. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly, you are still treating this like a public relations problem. It is not. Her voice remained controlled, but every word landed heavily. This is now a question of whether your company cooperates before the investigation becomes criminal. Nobody breathed for a second after that sentence. Rain rolled down the glass behind her in silver streaks, while thunder flashed somewhere beyond the skyline. Daniel looked around the room now, searching faces, calculating, watching. He had spent 20 years building Whitmore Capital into one of the most aggressive investment firms in Manhattan. He trusted almost nobody, but he trusted control. And for the first time in years, he no longer had it. Everyone stays seated, he ordered suddenly. Nobody leaves this room. The command sounded strong at first, but underneath it was fear. Naomi noticed immediately. So did Helen. Ethan lowered his eyes again, pretending to read his tablet while tension crawled through his chest. Daniel pressed both palms against the marble table and leaned toward Naomi. You said someone leaked information this morning. Who? Naomi studied him quietly for a moment before answering. I do not know yet. Daniel laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it now. Convenient. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You mocked my silence earlier, Mr. Whitmore. The room became still again. But silence is how people survive in companies like this. People stay quiet because they are afraid powerful men will destroy their careers for speaking honestly. Daniel opened his mouth to interrupt, but Naomi continued calmly. Today someone stopped being afraid. Helen suddenly stood from her chair. Daniel, we need to make a decision immediately. He turned toward her sharply. About what? Helen looked down at the federal waiver in Naomi's hands. If Naomi signs cooperation status before the investigators move formally, the company remains protected under internal disclosure agreements. She paused carefully. If she refuses, nobody needed her to finish the sentence. Daniel stared at Naomi now with something close to disbelief. Not because she held power, but because he had completely failed to see it until this moment. The quiet black woman sitting at the far end of the table had walked into this room already carrying the fate of everyone inside it. Another flash of lightning lit the windows behind her. Then suddenly the boardroom doors opened. Every head turned instantly. A security supervisor stepped inside, rainwater still visible on his dark coat collar. "Sir," he said carefully toward Daniel, "Federal counsel is requesting permission to come upstairs." The boardroom stayed frozen after the security supervisor spoke. Rain hammered harder against the 48th floor windows now, turning the skyline beyond the glass into a blur of silver lights and dark clouds. Daniel Whitmore stared toward the open doorway without answering immediately. For years, people had waited on his decisions. Entire companies had risen or collapsed depending on a sentence from him. But now the silence stretching through the room felt unfamiliar. Heavy. Dangerous. "How many?" Daniel finally asked without looking away from the door. "2 attorneys, sir," the supervisor replied carefully, "and 3 federal investigators." Nobody moved after hearing that. One executive quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his face with trembling fingers. Another stared down at the merger documents as though they had suddenly become toxic. Helen Pierce slowly sat back down, her expression pale beneath the cold boardroom lights. Naomi Carter remained still. Her navy folder rested neatly in front of her, untouched now, while the city storm reflected softly across the polished marble table. Daniel turned toward her again. "You knew this was coming." Naomi answered honestly. "I suspected they would move sooner once the acquisition entered final review." Daniel gave a bitter laugh under his breath. "And you sat there quietly while this entire company walked toward disaster." Naomi's eyes lifted calmly toward him. "I spent 6 months trying to stop the disaster before today." That answer hit harder than anyone expected. Ethan Cole felt it immediately. So did Helen. Because the truth inside Naomi's voice carried no arrogance. Only exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had warned people over and over until silence became easier than begging to be heard. Daniel walked slowly toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. His reflection stared back at him through the rain-darkened glass. Expensive suit. Perfect posture. Billion-dollar reputation. Yet, somehow he suddenly looked older than he had that morning. "Nobody enters this room yet," he ordered the security supervisor quietly. "Give us 5 minutes." "Yes, sir." The door closed again with a soft click. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Daniel stayed facing the skyline for several seconds before speaking again. "If I cooperate fully," he asked, "what happens?" Naomi studied him carefully before answering. "The company survives." Daniel turned halfway toward her. "And me?" Naomi did not rush the answer. Thunder rolled softly across the city outside while the room waited. "That depends on whether you were responsible," she said at last. The honesty in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. Daniel looked away again immediately. Helen noticed it. Ethan noticed too. Tiny reactions suddenly mattered now. Every glance, every pause, every breath. Naomi folded her hands together slowly. "Federal investigators are not only looking for financial misconduct," she continued quietly. "They are looking for who approved the transfers after internal warnings were filed." Daniel's jaw tightened again. Helen looked sharply toward him now, concern slowly replacing loyalty in her expression. "Daniel," she said carefully, "did you authorize anything connected to the offshore accounts?" Daniel answered too quickly. "No." Then came the pause. Small, barely visible, but Naomi saw it immediately. So did Helen. Ethan lowered his eyes again, suddenly unable to look at anyone. The room felt smaller now, tighter somehow, as though the storm outside had sealed every person inside together. Naomi reached for one final document inside the folder. She slid it slowly across the marble table toward Daniel. "Then perhaps you should explain this." Daniel frowned and picked up the page. The moment his eyes scanned the signature approval code near the bottom, all color drained from his face. Helen stood immediately. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ethan looked over just enough to see the date printed across the top of the document. 3 weeks earlier. Daniel's authorization. Directly connected to the flagged offshore transfers. Nobody spoke. Nobody even moved. The only sound left in the room was the rain striking the glass, while Daniel Whitmore stared silently at the proof that could destroy everything he had built. Daniel Whitmore kept staring at the document in his hands, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. The rain outside softened slightly now, turning into a steady rhythm against the towering glass walls surrounding the boardroom. Manhattan glowed beneath the storm clouds in blurred silver and amber lights, distant and cold. Inside the room, nobody dared speak first. Helen Pierce slowly lowered herself back into her chair, eyes fixed on the authorization code printed near Daniel's signature. Ethan Cole could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights now, a sound completely drowned out earlier by confidence and laughter. Funny how silence changed shape once fear entered a room. Naomi Carter watched Daniel carefully, but without satisfaction. There was no victory in her expression, no revenge. Only the tired stillness of someone who had spent too long carrying the weight of truths nobody wanted to hear. Daniel finally set the paper down. His hand moved slower than before. "I approved a transfer request," he said quietly. "That does not make me guilty of fraud." Naomi nodded once. "No. It makes you responsible for what happened after the warning signs were ignored." Daniel looked up sharply. "You think I knew where the money was going?" "I think," Naomi answered softly. "You stopped asking questions because the deal was making people rich." The words settled heavily across the room. Nobody argued with her. Not even Helen. Thunder rolled faintly across the skyline again, farther away now, like the storm was beginning to pass beyond downtown Manhattan. Daniel loosened his tie slowly, the first visible crack in the polished image he carried into every meeting. "You have no idea what it takes to run a company this size," he muttered. Naomi's eyes softened slightly at that. "Actually," she said quietly, "I do." Daniel frowned. Naomi reached into her folder one final time and removed a thin photograph worn slightly at the corners. She placed it gently onto the marble table. Ethan leaned forward first. Then, Helen. The picture showed Naomi standing in front of a federal building in Washington nearly 10 years earlier beside a group of investigators. Younger, smiling faintly, proud. Daniel stared at the badge clipped to her coat in the photo. Federal Financial Crimes Division. "You were an investigator," he said slowly. Naomi nodded. "For 11 years. Nobody in the room moved. The revelation changed something instantly. Suddenly her calmness made sense. Her precision, her patience, even her silence. Daniel looked genuinely stunned now. "Why leave?" Naomi glanced toward the rain sliding down the windows before answering. "My father suffered a stroke. I moved back to New York to take care of him." Her voice remained steady, but quieter now. "When I tried returning to federal work 2 years later, people saw a gap in my resume before they saw my experience." Ethan lowered his eyes again. Helen looked away toward the city. Naomi continued calmly. "Eventually, I stopped correcting people when they underestimated me. It became useful." Daniel sat completely still after hearing that. The same woman he mocked less than an hour earlier had once spent over a decade investigating corporate crimes at the federal level. And somehow nobody in the company had bothered learning that. The realization settled across the room like another storm entirely. Naomi folded her hands softly over the closed folder. "I never wanted this company destroyed," she said. "I wanted people here to remember that integrity is not weakness." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her this time. Not the quiet black woman at the end of the table. Not the compliance director everyone ignored. But the person who had spent months trying to protect thousands of employees while others chased profit and applause. Then the boardroom phone suddenly lit up beside Helen. Incoming call. Federal Counsel reception desk. Nobody reached for it immediately, because for the first time all day, the room understood something terrifying. Naomi Carter had been the smartest person in the building the entire time. The boardroom phone continued glowing silently beside Helen Pierce, its small red light, reflecting across the polished marble table like a warning nobody could ignore anymore. Rain still traced slow lines down the towering windows, but the storm outside had weakened now, leaving Manhattan wrapped in a cold silver haze beneath the late afternoon sky. Nobody reached for the phone. Not yet. Daniel Whitmore sat motionless at the head of the table, staring at Naomi Carter with an expression that had completely changed from the man who mocked her earlier that morning. The arrogance was gone now. What remained looked closer to realization. Helen finally inhaled sharply and answered the call. "This is Pierce." Her voice sounded thinner than usual. Everyone watched her carefully as she listened. "Understood," she said quietly after several seconds. "Please give us a moment." She ended the call and slowly placed the receiver down. "Federal counsel is requesting immediate cooperation status," she announced softly. "If we delay longer than 10 minutes, they will proceed without internal protections." The words settled over the room like falling concrete. One executive quietly cursed under his breath. Another removed his company badge and stared at it blankly. Ethan Cole sat completely still, watching Naomi instead of Daniel now. Somehow she remained the calmest person in the room despite carrying the heaviest burden. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face slowly before speaking. "What exactly do they want from us?" Naomi answered carefully. "Full disclosure, internal access, financial records, and one executive signature confirming voluntary cooperation before formal escalation begins." Daniel frowned slightly. "One signature." Naomi nodded once. "Mine." Silence again, but different this time. No longer hostile. No longer mocking. The room had crossed into something else entirely. Acceptance. Daniel looked down at the stack of papers scattered across the marble table, then toward the skyline beyond the glass. For years he had measured power through money, acquisitions, influence, fear. Yet somehow the person holding the real authority today was the woman everyone overlooked because she spoke softly and never demanded attention. Helen folded her hands tightly. "Together." "Naomi," she asked quietly, "if you sign, can the company survive this?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She looked around the room first. At the frightened executives. At Ethan sitting silently near the end of the table. At Daniel standing beneath the reflection of the storm-dark skyline. "Yes," she finally said. "But only if the truth stops being treated like the enemy." Nobody moved after that sentence. Daniel slowly walked back toward the table and stopped across from her. The overhead lights reflected faintly across the rainwater still clinging to the windows behind him. "I spent years believing confidence meant never showing weakness," he admitted quietly. Ethan looked up immediately. So did Helen. Daniel gave a bitter smile toward the floor. "Maybe that is why I laughed at silence. Because I thought quiet people had no power." Naomi watched him calmly, but said nothing. Daniel looked directly at her now. "I was wrong." The words were simple, barely above a whisper. Yet somehow they changed the atmosphere in the room more than any shouting could have. Helen closed her eyes briefly in relief. Ethan lowered his head, almost emotional, without fully understanding why. Naomi studied Daniel for a long moment before speaking. "Power is not measured by who controls the room, Mr. Whitmore." Her voice remained soft, steady. "It is measured by who protects people when protecting them costs something." Daniel swallowed hard after hearing that. Outside, the rain finally began slowing against the glass. The skyline brightened faintly beneath the clouds as late sunlight pushed weakly through the storm. Naomi reached for the federal cooperation waiver one final time. The entire room watched her hand move toward the signature line. Because everyone understood now that the future of Whitmore Capital no longer depended on wealth, reputation, or fear. It depended on whether the quiet black woman they mocked still believed the company was worth saving. Naomi Carter rested her fingers lightly on the federal cooperation waiver while the boardroom remained completely silent around her. The rain outside had almost stopped now, leaving small trails of water sliding slowly down the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. Pale evening sunlight pushed through the thinning clouds, washing the skyline in muted gold and gray. For the first time all afternoon, the storm no longer felt violent. It felt exhausted, much like everyone inside the room. Daniel Whitmore stood across from Naomi without speaking. His expensive suit jacket hung slightly open now, his tie loosened, the polished certainty he wore every day stripped away piece by piece over the last hour. Helen Pierce watched quietly from her seat, hands folded tightly together. Ethan Cole barely moved at all. Nobody wanted to interrupt whatever this moment had become. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the document one final time. One signature. That was all it would take to protect thousands of employees from the collapse waiting outside those doors. Yet the room understood something deeper now. This decision was no longer about money. It was about character. Daniel finally broke the silence. After everything, he said quietly, why would you still help us? Naomi looked up slowly. Because innocent people should not suffer for the arrogance of powerful ones. The answer landed softly, but nobody in the room could escape it. Daniel looked down at the marble table for a moment before speaking again. I humiliated you today. Naomi said nothing. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. And the truth is, I probably would have ignored you again if this room had not forced me to listen. Helen lowered her eyes after hearing that. Ethan stared at Daniel in stunned silence. Powerful men almost never admitted fault out loud, especially men like Daniel Whitmore. Naomi studied him carefully. There was no hatred in her expression, only the quiet sadness of someone far too familiar with being underestimated. People hear confidence differently depending on who it comes from, she said softly. Daniel looked at her immediately because he knew exactly what she meant. Naomi continued calmly. When men like you speak forcefully, people call it leadership. When women like me speak forcefully, people call it difficult. The room stayed still. And when black women stay quiet, she added gently, people assume we have nothing worth hearing. Daniel swallowed hard. The words carried no bitterness. Somehow that made them hurt more. Outside the windows, the clouds finally began breaking apart over Manhattan. Thin rays of sunlight reflected off distant buildings, scattering gold across the wet streets far below. Naomi uncapped her pen slowly. The soft click echoed through the boardroom. Every eye followed her hand. Daniel watched silently as she signed the cooperation waiver with neat, controlled strokes. No dramatic movement. No triumph. Just quiet responsibility. Helen released a breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. Ethan closed his eyes briefly in relief. Naomi slid the signed document across the table toward Helen. Federal counsel can come upstairs now, she said calmly. Helen nodded quickly and reached for the phone. Daniel remained standing exactly where he was, watching Naomi, trying to understand how someone he dismissed so easily had become the moral center of a room full of executives. Naomi gathered her folder slowly and rose from her chair. The movement felt strangely final. Daniel looked at her carefully. Naomi. She paused near the end of the table, but did not turn fully around. Daniel's voice softened in a way nobody there had ever heard before. Thank you. Naomi stood still for a second as evening light reflected softly across the windows beside her. Then she answered without anger or pride. Next time, Mr. Whitmore, listen before the crisis. Nobody spoke after that, because deep down, everyone in the room understood the same thing. The quietest person at the table had just taught the most powerful man in the building what leadership actually looked like. The boardroom doors opened quietly a few minutes later, and the federal attorneys stepped inside, carrying slim black briefcases still damp from the rain outside. Nobody rushed to greet them. Nobody tried to dominate the room anymore. Whitmore Capital's executives sat in complete silence beneath the soft evening light pouring through the towering glass walls overlooking Manhattan. The storm had finally passed. Water still clung to the windows in thin silver trails, but beyond them the city shimmered beneath a fading sunset painted in gold and steel blue. Naomi Carter stood near the end of the marble table with her folder held calmly against her side, while Helen Pierce handed over the signed cooperation waiver. The lead federal attorney reviewed the document carefully, then looked toward Naomi. Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Carter, he said respectfully. Respectfully. The word landed quietly in the room, but Daniel Whitmore noticed it immediately. Earlier that morning, people barely looked at Naomi when she entered the boardroom. Now federal officials addressed her like the most important person in the building. The attorney turned toward Daniel next. Mr. Whitmore, we will require access to financial records and internal communications beginning tonight. Daniel nodded once. No argument. No performance. Just acceptance. You will have full cooperation, he said quietly. The answer surprised several executives sitting nearby. Ethan Cole watched the exchange carefully from his seat, realizing he was witnessing something far bigger than a corporate investigation. He was watching pride collapse, and something more human slowly take its place. The attorneys moved toward Helen to begin discussing procedures, while Naomi quietly gathered the last papers from the table. She worked with the same calm precision she had shown all afternoon. No celebration, no bitterness, just dignity. Daniel watched her for several long seconds before finally speaking again. Naomi. She looked toward him. The room softened into silence around them. You saved this company today, he said. Naomi shook her head gently. No, I gave it a chance to become honest. Daniel lowered his eyes after hearing that. Outside, the last edge of sunlight broke through the clouds and reflected across the wet skyscrapers beyond the windows. The golden light stretched through the boardroom, warming the cold